My name is Sean, aka Watery Aquarius, and you're listening to the Hacking Astrology podcast. Here I teach you how to hack your astrology charts to help you deconstruct the toxic concepts that come along with learning astrology and teach you how to have a healthier relationship with astrology. Let's escape toxic astrology together. Hey, what's up, you guys? What's up, my raindrops? If you don't know what raindrops are, they are my audience name because my screen name is Watery Aquarius. So anyone who's part of my community is a raindrop. But yeah, so we're here at the second episode of the podcast. If you haven't noticed, what we're doing is we're doing like a solo podcast with me, and then we do like an interview with someone like an astrologer, and yeah, we'll just like alternate. So this is my solo episode about love, gender, sexuality, queerness, and like also just being like healthy in using astrology for like love compatibility and thinking about gender, sexuality, etc. But I do want to go ahead and say thank you to everyone who has supported the podcast. The support has been really, really great, and I'm super impressed with the numbers. Sorry, my cat's running around. I'm super impressed with the numbers, and I don't know. I just love having a platform. This podcast feels like my soapbox. We're gonna get him off the table. For anyone who's not watching the YouTube video, my cat just jumped on the table, so I had to get him off. Yeah, I don't know. I just love having this platform. I love talking about, I guess the ethics behind astrology and how we could be more responsible. And, I just think that it's important just to like even show like our perspectives as like professional astrologers to say, hey, here's how we use astrology. If you're new, like this is how we use it. Like we have experience with it. This is how we use it. This is how we deal with it. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has supported and to keep on sharing it, tell your friend, etc. And I also want to say that we have some pretty exciting things coming up. The podcast is definitely going to be more energized and a little bit juicier. Obviously still educational, but I think that'll be awesome to learn more about like astrologers' personal lives, and like the tea behind it. And just really understanding, where astrologers are, and how vulnerable they get. So stay tuned for some pretty exciting guests coming up. So last week we established that if you know the rising sign, which is the sign of the first house, you should know the signs of every other 11 houses. This is based on the natural order of the zodiac. And so this week, the hack of the week is that the signs that square your rising sign will be your midheaven and your IC. Your 10th house and your 4th house. So think about this. You have your first house, the picture the circle. You have your first house right here, and it's a circle, right? And when we have 12 sections, there's going to be 30 sections of 12. So we can expect that to get to the 10th house from the first house, we are crossing 3 signs, 3 houses, 30 degrees times 3, 90 degrees, right? And so in astrology, that aspect would be called a square. So that basically just says that there's just a challenge and a tension between 2 planets. But you can use this to guess people's signs and to see how the signs match up. So if you meet someone who's an Aries rising, they are a cardinal rising sign. So this means that they will have a cardinal 10th house, a cardinal 4th house, and a cardinal 7th house. This is because there are only 4 signs of each modality. There's 3 modalities, and they make 90-degree angles to each other. Yeah, so like that's one step and one thing that I've definitely paid attention to when I was learning astrology. And it really just clicked for me one day where I was like, oh snap, okay, the rising sign is the sign of your first house. If I know all the other houses, then I can pretty much guess like anyone's planets and like anyone's placements. Like if they tell me their sun and their moon and their rising, since I know what sign is in the first house, I can know where their sun and their moon is. And once I figured that out, astrology just got so much easier for me. It got so much easier for me to look at aspects, because now I look at the charts in degrees, like geometrically, really. So like I'm looking for, okay, Scorpio's a fixed sign. If there's any Aquarius transits, they're going to square each other because they are of the same modality. So I don't know, it just gets like a lot easier for me in that type of way, where it's just, I just visualize it in my head and I can kind of just do the math in my head, if that makes sense. And I think that makes me a better astrologer, and it has made me a better astrologer. So like when I say the podcast is hacking astrology, like that's exactly what I mean. We're hacking our birth chart. We're finding like tips and tricks to like make it easy. Also, if you want to learn more about your birth chart, on May 7th, I am releasing a live class. So a live class where we'll be on Zoom. And we're just gonna do an intro to astrology, and it's gonna get progressive over time. So anyone who's a little bit more advanced, like I plan on doing like classes where it's like asteroids and career, legacy and all that stuff. So yeah, I have the live class going on May 7th. I also have some eclipse readings for April 30th for the partial solar eclipse new moon in Taurus, which is the start of the eclipse season. I did some like recorded horoscopes for each rising sign, so they're up on my Snip feed if you want. Also, we lit our birth date candle. So we love birthday candle. And yeah, check out my link in bio, Sean P10, to get 10% off. And get a birthday candle. They smell really good, and it's specialized for your birthday. But yeah, like I'm doing a lot of different stuff, and yeah, I think it's just all going really well. I love what we're doing here. So next we'll do the roast of the week. So this is where I look at someone's placement and I roast it, but I give good advice and I don't hurt them. So this is a placement that EJ Duria 901 sent in, and they are a Aquarius Sun, Leo Moon, and a rising Taurus. Okay, first of all, like this person could be very stubborn. This person does not like change. This person wants it their way. If they can't have it their way, it's not gonna fly. This person is, I think, just very controlling and needs things to be a certain way. But I think also, what's interesting is that these are all fixed signs in the big three. So Aquarius, the sun would be opposite to the moon, and then Taurus, the ascendant, would square Aquarius and Leo. So there's a lot of tension going on in terms of like identity, who you are, your emotional self, and lots of difference going on here. So it's like, and since this person is a rising Taurus, this means that they have Aquarius in their midheaven and they have Leo in their IC. So their sun is in their midheaven, and their moon is in their fourth house. Their IC. So this person, they find identity in their career, in their achievements, in their successes, but they also find a lot of like emotional security at home. They find like love at home, and they want to be loved. Like this person wants to be loved so badly, but I feel like they try to hide behind this like Saturnian, like I'm cool, I'm wise, I got it all together. But they just want to be loved. They just want to be welcomed. They just want to be celebrated truly. So it's interesting having like a Aqua Leo moon opposition. This means this person was born during a full moon, so they would be dramatic in that type of way. Like these two sides of each other. Like I want love, or like stay away from me, with the Aquarius. But yeah, let's move on to the next one. I hope that helped. So this is for Gouache the Squash, and they are Taurus Mars. So how can I roast a Taurus Mars? Taurus Mars don't do much, but when they do, they put a lot of effort into it. Taurus Mars are kind of scary, actually. They're the type to kind of lay low, play it cool, but when they need to strike at you, they will strike at you super hard. And like keep in mind, like the opposite sign of Taurus is Scorpio, so they know how to get someone good. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like this person is a good fighter, but only like when there's a good cause or when they're like super invested or like fighting for their friends. But I think otherwise, like they take things pretty calmly and pretty sensitively. They're just lazy, you know? I get it. I'm a Taurus moon. Okay, the next one is for Andres Juradoso, and they have a Leo Mars retrograde. I actually have a Leo Mars retrograde. In Placidus, my Leo Mars is in my third house of communication and words. And in whole sign, it's in my second house of financial security and material possession, materialism, all that stuff. But yeah, I think like with the Leo Mars retrograde, you know, the Leo Mars is interesting. The Leo Mars really, you know, gets energy, gets vitality from this act of pride, right? You know, Mars is all about energy and like pushing things forward. But I think like to roast this Leo Mars retrograde, they are the person who have like the most confidence, but then when it comes down to it, they like shy away. They're like, no, no, no. They'll like talk crap, but they really won't be about it. Am I talking about myself? I don't know. But I can definitely back up my crap. Like, I'm just not with this internet beef. Like, see me in person. Like, you already know what it is. I'm from Brooklyn. But anyway, yeah, this type of person who like thinks they're the bleep, but they're really not at the end of the day. But they're like so showy about it. And I think like Mars retrograde people, they have energy usage issues, so they might be like here and there, like fluctuate a little bit based on their ego and based on like how they feel. Like if you find a Leo Mars retrograde, like compliment them. I feel like that would like lift their spirits up so much. Compliment me. Okay, so we're here to talk about the astrology of love. And so before we jump into it, I just want to give like a basic overview of love and astrology, and some interesting things about it that I've learned along the way. So in astrology, we're looking at the chart and each house rules over a certain area of life, right? Well, the seventh house rules over relationships. It rules over partnerships. It rules over best friendships, but it rules over like really close partnerships or relationships, lovers. But what's interesting is that the seventh house in astrology, they look at it in the same light as contracts and deals. So when it comes to a relationship in astrology, it's really a compromise. It's actually a back and forth. It's actually a mutual like give and take. It's actual give and take, and it's like the ideal seventh house like manifestation is a balanced relationship, is someone who can stand up for themselves and the other person can stand up for themselves, and they have the boundaries all set, everything communicated, just like a deal, just like a contract. So I think that's interesting. You know, it's interesting for astrology to look at the seventh house in terms of contracts and deals, because it also reminds me of marriage. But it's interesting because if you don't want to get married, what does that mean? And like obviously it still applies in terms of like just having close relationships, but it's interesting to see how like the basis of astrology like just puts this kind of like heteronormative like marriage type of label onto us. And in the astrology love, we also look at Venus, and Venus is the planet of love, of beauty, of aesthetics, even of justice. And actually Venus was previously like before like they redefined Venus, she was looked at as a war goddess who went to different cities and established justice and established liberty. And we'll talk about that later. But it's interesting to think about how we look at Venus today in terms of like this figure that kind of just attracts everything. Whereas, you know, she was actually looked at as a war goddess in the past, someone who took action. So it's very interesting. And then in your birth chart, we could look at the eighth house to look at a sort of different type of marriage. So like the eighth house is kind of like a sharing of the resources. So it's like combining the incomes that you have, combining the money that you have, sharing it with each other, like joint resources. And in a marriage, that's what pretty much happens when you sign a contract. You share resources. This is also like moving in with someone, eighth house stuff. But your eighth house is also about your intimacy and sexuality. So you can look to that to figure out more about your relationship with love in an intimate way, in a sexual way. And then your fifth house, which is the house of creativity, of like self-expression, but it's also the house of flirting and casual affairs. So it's like more about romance more than anything. It's more about having fun, being pleasured by your partner, rather than the eighth house, which is more about like intimate, deep, passionate connection. So when you know astrology and you know all these different things like the seventh house, the eighth house, the fifth house, Venus, and we start to look at that in terms of like love and perhaps how that might affect us. Like, you know, if Venus is going retrograde, we might overreact, or if like there's a certain Pluto is going through our fifth house, or like the moon is going through our eighth house, like we might freak out, and you know, it might be the activation of a relationship, but it might not. And you know, you kind of have to figure out how to deal with that. You know, how do you deal with looking at a transit and it seeming like an activation of a relationship, and then that relationship not coming? Like, how do you deal with like those like opposing expectations of your transits? And to that, I say we have to be open-minded. I think it's just, you know, we could look at it, okay, this might happen, but it might not happen. This might happen, but it might not happen. I'm going to look at that. I'm going to observe. I'm going to take in this transit and just see what happens. But it's just good to have notes on it. That's how I look at astrology. They're just kind of like external notes that I use to inform my personal human perspective. And I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm saying this is what I do. And so I'm just offering you kind of my perspective and hope that it helps you. But anyway, you know, when we get into the astrology of love and we start using it, it can get a little problematic. You know, relationships and love are sensitive things. You know, we put our heart out for someone, we put our vulnerable self out for someone, we put our inner child out for someone, and when someone betrays that part of us, it is quite painful. So relationships and love are sensitive things, and there's a lot of trauma, you know, with people who have been in relationships. So when you kind of use astrology and you're like, oh, I could look at love in astrology, it kind of can get a little messy where you might combine your trauma and your personal experiences with archetypes and like certain things that are like set in stone in astrology. The reason why people use astrology for love is that it offers you a sort of control. It gives you an answer to unanswered questions. It helps you understand like why did that person do that? It gives you like a reason, maybe even an excuse. But when we get into sign compatibility, they're like, oh, I like Scorpios, I like Capricorns, oh, I don't like Libras. That's when it gets messy, because when you meet someone, you meet them for who they are. However, astrology is a system of symbols, and with zodiac signs, those are symbols, and there's lots of meaning that go along, lots of meaning and expectation that goes along with those symbols. So when we start to use these symbols in real life, we can kind of, you know, try to understand people, you know, for who they are based on their astrology, which is very helpful, and I do it myself. Sign compatibility can create a toxic narrative in your head that kind of overwhelms the way that you approach real life, which I don't think is smart. However, we can use it to inform our actions, right? So the key here is to approach love in astrology and your dependence on astrology in love, in relationships, with balance and wisdom. That means not checking their transit chart or looking at the synastry. And speaking of, let's talk about synastry. So synastry charts are actually the compatibility charts in astrology. They basically lay one person's birth chart on another person's birth chart. And we can see which planets one person would have in another person's house. So let's say you're an Aries rising, you have Taurus in the second house. If your partner has a Taurus moon, their moon will be in your second house. That's also one of the keys to astrology that I had to learn before I like really got good at it. But when you take like certain experiences of like dating certain signs, or, you know, getting broken up with certain signs, or loving certain signs a lot, it can be limiting, right? Because you're not opening yourself up to anybody who deserves you, right? You might be even blocking your blessings by using astrology to say, no, I'm not messing with you, you're a Scorpio. You know, you might be denying the love of your life just because they have a certain sign. So yes, they might exhibit certain traits of a Scorpio, right? But let them prove it to you. Like, let them show it to you. If there's anything that does go bad, call it out, you know? Like why do we have to say no to people like right off the bat? So the problem is when it comes to relationships and looking at astrology and certain expectations from signs, what it does, it removes the accountability from you or your other partner or partners. You're basically blaming everything on the astrology. You know, oh, they were Scorpio, that's why they, you know, really hurt. Like, no, you don't deserve that kind of mistreatment or like disrespect, you know, regardless. So I just feel like it kind of like limits and kind of dilutes the reality of certain humans' behaviors. And I think that this might come from people who are new in astrology, who don't really understand like the nuance of the birth chart and, you know, kind of the ethics of astrology as well, that, you know, certain transits don't, you know, determine anything. They can show up in different ways. And even when people look at certain synastry charts and they see certain placements that are super powerful for a relationship, let's say like Jupiter in the 7th house, or like a moon in the 4th house, which is good for like feeling like you're at home with somebody. And then they meet someone or they have a crush and they get their birth chart somehow, and then they look that and then they see that placement that they have a good relationship placement, and then they're like, oh, we're destined to be together. This is why we're together. This is why we're meant to be together. Like, and I think that could get even toxic because then you're using astrology in the chart to say, no, we actually would get along. But what about like the real human interaction and the conversations in real life? Like, what does that look like? So I just feel like we need to be wise and kind of separate our like use of astrology in our main like analysis and even assessment of people that we meet, that we want to date. And I think that that's shady. Like, you're looking at someone's chart, and the synastry chart and looking at all these like aspects and placements, and like you probably didn't even ask them about that. It just feels like an invasion of boundaries for me. Also, on the other end of the stick, you know, we can get scared about certain like placements that you have with people that you might already be in a relationship with, or you might see yourself getting into a relationship with, and this might deter you from getting into the relationship. So like, I want to ask you, like, would you actually deny someone if their Pluto was in your 7th house? You know, like, would you? I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, it depends on the person, right? Like, I probably just wouldn't just deny them based off that, but I definitely keep my eye open. But I'm not gonna let it like decide the way I assess this relationship. And like, the thing is, synastry charts, there's always so much good, there's always so much bad. Like, you could find anything, you can say anything, you know, but the thing is, truly, you could make any relationship work. Any relationship can work if you communicate well and set boundaries. And maybe later in the podcast, we'll talk about like twin flames, because then people look at like charts to see if they're like someone else is their twin flame, and then they think like that's their partner for the rest of their life. Like, okay, fine. I think like twin flame is a fine concept, but I also feel like people use it in a very toxic way to kind of like depend on someone and like hope that they'll come back. You know, when Mercury goes retrograde, the world goes crazy. You know, people are like, like, why is this all happening? When Venus went retrograde, you know, people went a little wild as well. But it's like people actually get scared during these times. People actually get scared that like bad things are going to happen to them during retrogrades, right? And I don't think this is healthy. You know, we shouldn't use astrology to make us nervous, to make us scared. You know, we should use astrology to empower ourselves. So honestly, like, the way that I use astrology in my life for love, I don't look at the synastry chart right away. I wait. I can definitely visualize the synastry in my head based on someone's placements, but that takes a little bit of mind work, and I don't just do that. Obviously, I know maybe what placements, what signs might work well for me based on my chart, and I can know like what placements, what signs are in what house, and just predict a bunch of different dynamics like that. But I try not to look at like the synastry charts until later, until the relationship is formed and stable and we know each other and we know that like this is good. And I don't really cut someone off just because they have a certain sign or a certain placement, you know. It's awesome to just get to know new people and see, you know, how they actually are, based on their chart, right? Okay, so I was reading this book called Post-Colonial Astrology, by Kat Sparkly Alice, I think. And I read so many interesting things, like based on like gender and like planets in astrology and sexuality. So I just kind of want to reiterate it to you. So listen. The history of astrology developed out of white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy. The ways that we see Venus and Mars and gender, the ways that Jupiter and the Sun and rulership have been defined, have served power rather than working against it. Astrology, as we have inherited it, does not offer us authentic identity. Astrology offers us a Roman identity, Roman belonging, Roman humanity. This is why we must continually work to destroy astrology as we practice it, because we look for identity from it. So Alice is basically saying, like, destroy astrology. Like, we find identity through it, we define our lives through it. Like, this is why we need to constantly break down astrology. So interesting, right? Like, why would you destroy astrology? But no, totally understand what they're saying. Like, the only way that we can stop relying on astrology is if we kind of get rid of our toxic and dependent relationship on it. So Alice says, in Rome, Venus is a war goddess. In contemporary astrology, Venus gets attached to peace and abundance. However, in the Roman understanding, peace is never the absence of war, but rather is always symbolized by the presence of material abundance. The Renaissance is the first time we begin to see Venus described as a love goddess, specifically as a love goddess who is typically described through the eyes of a male suitor. Her duality now emerged from hypersexualized feelings around morality. The Renaissance version of Venus was either the divine goddess, chaste and pure, who represented divine innocence, or she was the debauched goddess, fertile and wanton, who represented the eternal whore. The hypersexualized imagery around the Renaissance Venus is not only a gendered relation, but a fundamental relation between nature and civilization. The anxieties that the hypersexual images of Venus express, vulnerability, temptation, excess, may be expressed through gendered aesthetics. So we have basically gendered Venus and kind of put Venus in a certain box of femininity based on certain traits. The social world transforms, and you know, our definition of like sexuality, gender, femininity, masculinity does change over time, right? For example, the moon was originally associated with markets, with borders, foreigners, and I'll tell you why. So Alice says, only after industrialization does lunar imagery become strongly associated not with fortune and materiality, which is kind of like what the moon was associated with before, which is about like our body, our somatic body, how we feel, fortune, but especially with womanhood and reproductive labor. Before industrialization, the moon stands for markets, borders, and foreigners. The association between the moon and the reproductive labor within modernity, as we will see, does not bypass the moon's association to materiality and the market. Rather, it travels to diversely gendered bodies through the market. So listen, reproduction under colonialism likens the reproducing body to metal and the reproduced body to merchandise. The woman of color becomes a metaphor for the market. Bodies that also become signifiers of the market are represented as metallic. The moon begins as the market and becomes the reproductive body through race theater. Reproduction under capitalism does not produce life but things. So the moon, what they're basically saying is that the definition of the moon has changed over time based on capitalism. Because back then, the market was about like trading with foreign countries. And now the market is more about us working, pretty much. We are the products. We are the merchandise for capitalism. We are the products of capitalism that keep it going. So because the moon was originally associated with markets, since they're birthing human bodies that participate in the system of capitalism, which is associated with the market, that is why the moon was originally associated with like markets, and now it's associated more with like emotions and birth and family and womanhood. So I think it's so interesting to learn about the history of how we got here with these astrology archetypes. Like we have to look at the historical context. Like what is the historical like context that have developed the stereotypes of, for example, Venus into what she is today? And maybe even archetypes change over time as society changes, as culture changes. So I'm pretty excited to see what will happen in the future. You know, like will we see certain like planets get redefined based on different social and cultural experiences that we're having? And another thing, people always talk about like female Scorpio versus male Scorpio, and if there's a difference. And people always ask like me, like, is there a difference, Sean? And I say yes, because if you think about it, we do have the signs, we have the archetypes of the signs. But we also do have other influences in our environment, such as society, that can affect a certain energy. So that's the thing. We have to understand that there are so many different influences in the world, and it's not just astrology saying this is it. Like there's stuff that frames astrology even. But anyway, you know, if you think about it, if you have a certain archetype like Scorpio or let's say Capricorn, and you assign certain gender roles to it, let's say man and woman. So we know that in masculinity, a masculine person might be a little bit aggressive, a little bit dominant, a little bit maybe rude up front. And a feminine person might be a little bit more polite, a little bit more receptive, a little bit more forgiving, more understanding. And we know that masculinity can get toxic. So when we combine like toxic masculinity with a Capricorn archetype, like you'll see someone who doesn't care about anyone else, that they might care only about their successes, their achievements, their responsibilities, whereas a Capricorn woman might be a little bit more understanding, still a little bit stern and stoic, but they can kind of be empathetic a little bit more. And I'm not saying that, you know, men are, you know, not empathetic. I'm saying that when these gender roles get toxic, that's when there can be like a difference between man and woman and signs, right? So, you know, I don't want to say that, oh, like Capricorn men, Capricorn women. And I mean, I'm not even the type of person to like talk about that anyway. Like I'm not going to talk about people in the binary. Like I don't think that helps me, and I don't think that's very inclusive. So I'm not going to talk about Capricorn men and Capricorn women, but as a concept, I could definitely see that being valid, you know? For example, Capricorn and Cancer are cardinal signs. And if we lived in a matriarchal society rather than a patriarchal society, women would rule the world, and maybe there would be like toxic femininity. I don't know, like maybe not, but probably not. But like patriarchal society can say that, okay, the sun is more dominant. Another thing I don't like when people do astrology is that they will sexualize certain placements. So if you have Scorpio placements, if you have 8th house placements, if you have 5th house placements even, they'll kind of like sexualize you in a way. You can kind of say, ooh, you're sexual, you like having sex and being around and all that kind of stuff. Some people are asexual. Some people don't feel like sexual attraction to anyone. And it's just really uncomfy. You know, we're crossing boundaries that we shouldn't. Like in the workplace, you wouldn't cross like a sexual harassment boundary. So why would you do it normally in life when you just want to respect people? You know, like I just think that like sexuality and like intimacy like that needs to be talked about carefully in astrology, because you don't know who you're talking to and you don't know how they go about their sexuality. Okay, and one last thing I want to talk about is queerness. So by definition, queerness is a theoretical approach that critically deconstructs and challenges binaries, such as male and female or heterosexual and homosexual. It is anything that is not normal or not accepted. It is anything that is not normal or not accepted by hegemonic masculinity. Anyone who is gay is queer because you are categorized as the minority. So if you're not normal, you're queer, you know, in any sort of way, because you don't work in the hegemonic, you know, society or hegemonic group. So you're not like getting power a lot. But when it comes to queerness and astrology, if you want to look at like a feeling of abnormality, feeling like you're not normal, feeling like you're queer, it can be with your sexuality, but just feeling like you're maybe even treated as an outcast. These placements might show that. Any aspects of 8th house can show issues with astrology. The 11th house is about trying new things. The 12th house is about hiding things in the subconscious. So there might be like some closeted people going through some 12th house stuff, or people who don't like their sexuality to be a big part of their identity, which is totally fine. Uranus is all about breaking norms, individuality. It's like one of the hugest parts of queerness in your chart. So if you have a strong Uranus, if you have Uranus aspecting any of your planets, this can show that you might be different, and that you might be queer. The South Node is also pretty queer because it's just like the head cut off and just kind of experiencing life as it goes. You know what's interesting, as I realize this, I have my South Node conjunct my moon in the 11th house, so I'm just so queer, I'm so abnormal. I am queer though. Mercury is a trans planet, you know. Mercury is really like the grayscale planet of the world. It offers us a why, and what does that mean? So like if you have moon and Mercury ruled houses, Venus moons, Aquarius placements because it has a connection to Uranus and being different, and mutable placements because they're the most adaptable and open-minded. So I think it's important to talk about like, you know, queer experience in astrology, because we always talk about like who is dominant, who already has power. We don't talk about the people who don't have power, the people who are outcasts in society. You know, the 11th house is the collective. The 11th house is how you help the world, you know. So I feel like even the 11th house does offer a sense of queerness and a sense of that helping those who are not invited into a normal society. But I think it's so important as an astrologer to like queer astrology, to make astrology a little bit more open-minded, because you know the astrology that we do today is setting the standard for the future, and a lot of methods and concepts and ideas that we have today are affecting budding astrologers right now. So we have to be wise, I think, as astrologers and like what we talk about, and we can do so much more. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for part 2 of episode 2, where I talk to JoJo Astrology. Welcome to 11th house, an astrologer who has been into astrology since he was a kid. And I got into astrology when I was like 18, so he was into astrology way earlier than me. But stay tuned for that episode. That's going to be awesome. Great vibes. And yeah, I hope this episode helped you. I hope this episode, you know, kind of stirred up your mind a little bit, gave you some new things to think about. Don't forget to rate, review, and share the podcast. Rate it 5 stars right now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon, whatever you're on, YouTube. Leave a comment. Let me know how you are. Let me know how what your 7th house sign is in, and we could talk about that. So yeah, thanks for watching the Hacking Astrology podcast. And if you're not following my socials, you can follow me at Water Aquarius on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. See you later.